Hey folks, Matt Easton here of Scholagladiatoria. And so I'm going to talk very briefly about early maces. Now when I say early maces, I mean early medieval maces, because of course the mace as an object has been around since prehistory. We can't really say when the mace was first invented really, because I mean you could call early so-called stone axes, at least the type that were fixed into shafts, not hand axes obviously, as a form of mace, a sort of edged mace. They're sort of halfway between a mace and an axe in actual fact. But of course stone maces themselves go all the way back to prehistory and were used extensively by certain people in the ancient world, famously so by the Egyptians for example. They could be made of all sorts of materials. There are other videos on the internet and of course articles, Wikipedia even, talking about this very subject. You can make it of stone, of bone, you can just make a mace of wood in fact. You can make the whole thing of bone or horn or all these kind of materials. Now, in the medieval period, during what are commonly called the Dark Ages, so the early medieval period, so up until about 1000 AD, maces were probably, pretty much in Europe anyway, at a low point in that they weren't really popular weapons at all. And yet after, or from about 1000 AD, we start to see maces appear again. Now, why might this be? Well, I would argue that the obvious reason is probably something to do with the increasing prevalence of male armour, or just armour in general. So up until about, the Norman period, so around 1000 AD, up until that point, since the fall of the Roman Empire, at least in Western Europe, there wasn't an awful lot of armour going around. Yes, of course there was mail and there were plate helmets, if you imagine the figure of Sutton Hoo, but you've got to bear in mind those are very high status individuals. The majority of people who might have been involved in combat during the migration period and the earlier part of the Viking era probably didn't have much in the way of armour at all. If they were lucky they might have a helmet, and the helmet might not necessarily be made of metal always, or might only be partially made of metal. If we look at things like the Benty Grange helmet and so on. But once we get to about 1000 AD, it seems that male armour, pretty much head to foot, long hauberk with long sleeves and fairly long down the body to the thighs or even knees, had become relatively common. Now mail is one of those interesting things of course, that the longer it's being made, the more of it there is around, and it doesn't cease to exist when that generation dies off. So the great thing about mail, and we see this in the Middle Ages, is that as more and more mail was made, and more mail continued surviving, there was sort of an increasing mound of mail available. And we see, for example, in the 15th, 16th century, we see elements of mail, for example voiders and things like this, that seem to be made out of earlier mail garments, because of course the mail was available. So if you had a spare mail shirt and you needed a new avantel for your bassinet, then you'd possibly just cut out the mail out of a mail shirt and tailor it and adapt it for that purpose. Now this is where maces come back into it. So first of all, where does this come from? This is from Todd of Todd Stuff, and I'll put the link below. These cost about £85 I think in the UK, about 100 euros, and they are recreations of a type of mace that was around in the 12th to 14th centuries. Now one of the notable things about them is the heads, there we go, are made of bronze, and that's something that perhaps surprises some people, that bronze was still being used for weapons in the late Middle Ages, even up until the 14th century. And that's quite simply because if you're going to make a mace, you really want something, you don't need it to retain an edge particularly well, and don't think that bronze is soft. Bronze is harder than a lot of people realise, and in fact bronze can be as hard as iron pretty much, not as hard as steel obviously, but nevertheless for a mace head, if you really want something that's kind of a bit pointy and relatively heavy, then bronze is just as good as anything. And of course you can cast it in complex shapes relatively easily in a sand mould or a clay mould, this kind of thing. Various stone moulds even were used, but various types of mould, and it means that you can design a shape, usually in wax, and then by lost wax principle, you can design a shape of a mace head and then you can cast lots of them in bronze. So it's actually quicker and easier to make potentially, and at a certain point possibly cheaper as well than an iron or a steel mace head. And if you don't need your mace head to be made of iron or steel, well, why not use bronze? And so you've got to think about this type of weapon principally being used against unarmoured people and people wearing mail armour for the most part, and helmets and elements of plate armour. Obviously when these were still being used in the 14th century, most people by that point were, well, not most people, but most soldiers were predominantly still wearing mail, although plate was starting to come in, and this type of mace pretty much gets superseded by slightly more advanced types of mace as we go more into the age of plate. So this is really, I would describe it as the mace for the age of mail. Now if you imagine the Bayard Tapestry, 1066 and all that, right the way through to the early 14th century or end of the 13th century, you've got the majority of soldiers who can afford it having mail over gambeson with a helmet of some kind, be it a great helm or an open face helmet. And this type of percussive weapon with spikes on it, the spikes of course help to focus the force and focus the impact force and bite into. They're not necessarily there to break the mail, don't think of it like that. They're more about, rather than skipping off or glancing off, means that when you hit something, much like a poleaxe hammerhead, when it hits something it's more like to bite and therefore focus all of the force through at that point. But of course if you're using them against unarmoured people, the fact that they've got spiky bits on, if you smash someone in the head with one of these, it's more likely to break their skull apart into pieces and do them more grievous injury. And indeed if you hit soft fleshy parts, it's more likely to hurt and wound them than if it was a smooth-headed mace. Todd's done a great job, as he does with everything with this. It's, I think, probably an ash handle with a bronze head, securely fitted, and one thing I should mention about these is it's a very kind of almost universal and utilitarian design that went right the way through and was revived in World War I. And in fact you can see World War I trench clubs which look almost exactly like this being a recreation, I believe, of a 14th century and I believe Scandinavian archaeologically found example. So there we go. You can see it's got sort of pyramidal spikes all around. It's a nice handy thing, and probably most maces were of this kind of length, because remember of course that the people using these would themselves be wearing armour and would almost always be carrying a shield, fairly large shield, for most of the period of these being used. So think of Norman so-called kite shield going through to the kind of larger heater shields, and at the end of their use perhaps the slightly smaller heater shields, but still heater shields nevertheless. So knightly shields essentially. So large shield, iron, steel, helmet and mail hauberk, at least for most of the period of this use. So this is a shortish weapon because the shield enables you to get in close and go for places like kneecaps and collarbones and faces and the inside of the shield arm and and the person's sword arm or mace arm and all of this kind of thing. Can these be used defensively by themselves? Yes, to an extent. You can knock people's weapons aside, you can deflect, you can block if you need to, but predominantly the mace is used for striking whilst the shield is used for blocking, I think, in the earlier period. But there we go. So Todd stuff, spiked, kind of middle of the medieval period, so 12th to 14th century spiked mace. And he does do different designs of these. Again, I'll put the link below, but he does different designs of these bronze-headed mace. And they're nice, handy things. And I won't mention home defence, but I'll leave you thinking about what I'm thinking about here. Okay, cheers folks. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, follow us on Facebook. You can buy t-shirts through Spreadshirt, support us on Patreon or follow us on Pinterest. Thank you.